Wait.
Hi. This is my presentation on Halliday's article that we read, Language and the Theory of Codes. I apologize, this is my second take. I had a nice movie maker production for you, but it corrupted or something. It's not sending, and I'm not opening it, so this is my second take on it. So if it's a little more slapdash and rush, I'm sorry about that. If you have not seen it, it should be posted. Hopefully it gets posted along with this. There is a PowerPoint presentation. It's about 10 minutes or so long that gives you a little bit of background on Halliday. Some of that information might be useful to help you fill in the blanks a little bit about the article. Not that you really need a ton of information to figure it out. But in any case, I would recommend you go ahead and watch that first and then watch this video. So if you haven't seen it yet, go back and do that now, and wait on you. Okay, we're done waiting. So, Halliday, Language and the Theory of Codes. This is basically a polemic. It's not a research article by any means. It's a piece that deals with the theory of codes as they relate, a lot of ways they relate to Halliday's theories of systemic functional linguistics. Through it, part of the issue is talking about codes as a valid option and looking at linguistic analysis. The other part of it is talking about how Bernstein couldn't possibly have anything like the deficit theory in mind when he started writing about codes, and there's some slightly blustery language about that in the place of the article. For the most part, though, it's not a huge sustained argument. It's mostly a polemic with some interesting concepts thrown in about how to look at elaborated and restricted codes as socialized entities within language. And a lot of the article I'm not going to talk about, because there's a good chunk of the article that recaps research that's been done in code work within the school that Bernstein started. There's not any detail presented on that research, so it's really hard to sort of analyze it for any sort of validities or methodological issues or anything like that. It's kind of a laundry list sort of thing. So there's a chunk of the article that I'm really not going to pay a ton of attention to. It just didn't seem like it would be well worth our time. Not much to talk about there. So, language and the theory of codes. We start out by talking about code as a mode of language use, and Halliday spends a lot of time talking about code as part of the social construction or the social order that's been interwoven within language. He starts off quoting Bernstein from 1971, "The semantic function of language is the social structure." This fits in really well with Halliday's views of language because it's a linguistic background or school that looks at, if you looked at the PowerPoint, you know this, it looks at how language conveys three different meanings, meanings of ideation, meanings of interpersonal, and meanings of textual or metalinguistic meanings. Obviously, the social relationship issue is a big component of language meaning for Halliday's framework. Context and social relations are a fundamental and significant aspect of language use. He talks about that in the context of the article, and meaning is the result of a social construction of reality. Meaning in language is something encoded by an agreed upon social code or agreed upon social convention, and that social convention is a construction of reality for the speaker, and it gets reflected linguistically. This is an issue that we'll come back to later, but anyway, for Halliday, semantic function being part of a social structure is a really big point for him. Code is not a register, dialect, or language. When part of the article talks about how code is different from other phenomena that have already been marked within language use, and he quotes Hassan quite a bit, who did some research in this aspect. He wants to really carve out a space for code to be considered a viable level of linguistic analysis separate from things like register and dialect. Code is not a dialect. Dialects have similar meanings, but the surface ways in which those meanings are expressed are different. Code is not a register. Registers will differ in meaning because registers also differ in context. The world of the auto worker is not exactly the same as the world of the shipbuilder, is not exactly the same as the world of the English professor. The ways of looking at reality and talking about them linguistically have their own certain registers. We've talked about this before. Code is a more generalized or global aspect of language than either register or dialect. He's very big on this whole idea that it is something that is not particular, instantaneous, or part of an instant, but it is a medium-sized trend. We'll kind of get to that in a second. However, it's not such a predominant issue that it actually consists of its own separate language. A person who speaks an elaborated code and a restricted code can understand each other in certain ways, apparently. Oh, and you know, one of the other things I didn't talk about when I was doing talking about the summary, Halliday does spend a certain part of time with this article going through the differences between elaborated and restricted code, and they're nothing near what we read about in the Bernstein article earlier in the semester. The difference between being fluid versus being sort of closed off and structured, as one being more unplanned and verbose, and unassuming of semantic or intention, semantic background or intention, whereas the other one is unplanned, assumes common reference, assumes common intention, a lot of the meaning in restricted code being outside of the linguistic code. Okay, code as performance, not competence. Here's where we get to a crux of a very interesting point in the article, because there is one sort of moment where it looks like Halliday is trying to construct an argument for code, for Bernstein's definitions of elaborated and restricted codes, as not in any way possibly having anything to do with the deficit theory of language. Remember, the deficit theory of language being that a person who speaks a restricted code is not available or open to understand all the semantic intents of someone who speaks an elaborated code, and this has a big impact on schooling because the language of school is an elaborated code. So the attacks on Bernstein has been that the discussion of students with restricted code have deficits. They have linguistic or cognitive deficit that makes it difficult for them to learn because they do not have access to the elaborated code. And of course Halliday wants to say that's impossible, or he's trying to say that's impossible. And this little bit of an argument that he presents here is really the major thrust of any sort of elongated, laid out argument about Bernstein not being able to produce or result in a restricted code or deficit theory model of language. We'll talk about it. Code is performance, not competence. So for those of you who remember when we talk about Chomsky, competence is the user's knowledge of their language. That's the Chomskyan view of language. Don't mind that noise, that's my cat scratching. Performance is the language act or performance of language, which can differ in quality from competence. And those two things in Chomskyan views are very, very, they're delineated, they're separated. There's a point, and this has to do with some of the esoteric issues in dealing with laying out the theory of universal grammar that really doesn't concern us here. But Chomsky really wants to look at performance and actual speech acts or writing acts or language acts as being external entities that do not, by nature, completely reflect what a person's competence in language is. So the knowledge of language, which has to do with lexicogrammatical function and semantics and pragmatics and all sorts of things, but mostly for Chomsky it has to do with syntax. Those aspects don't get reflected adequately or accurately within performance because we have so many performance miscues. For example, look at this presentation. Let's see. In other words, codes are different patterns or habits of speech. This is Halliday's. This is a quote of Halliday from the article. This formation clearly seems to rule out any interpretation of codes in terms of deficit. So, by virtue of, at one point in time, Bernstein saying that codes were a performance aspect and not a competence aspect, that placed codes outside the mental cognitive framework or the linguistic ability framework. It put it as sort of performance of speech, and that clearly, once you move outside the realm of linguistic ability, competence, and knowledge, that absolutely would make it incompatible with a deficit theory of language. And this is the one time that he says, here's the clear instance of where this code theory can have nothing to do with deficit theory. This is probably his strongest argument-wise sentence in the piece, and then it kind of gets obliterated in a certain way. Because of the fact that Halliday spends quite a bit of time right after that maneuver talking about how performance and competence are actually the same thing. Now, if you recall from the PowerPoint presentation where there was that little chart and we were looking at different versions of context and different versions of language based on different aspects of time and looking at it, this is kind of the same sort of view. Within Halliday's FL framework, there is a view of language as sort of being part of a continuum, and that aspects of performance are actually just instances, small little bits of instances that actually conspire to create a whole system. So what we have are two different views of language, but they're both considered for Halliday the same thing. There's a short view, and the metaphor he likes to use is the weather, versus the long view, which is, according to the metaphor, climate. So there is a notion of the climate of a language or the climate of an environment having a kind of tenor or systematicity to it, but there's a difference between that and weather, different weather that we have every day.